You walk alone through twilight woods, feeling the ancient magic that hums through the air, winding between trees like an invisible web. The forest seems almost sentient, whispering secrets in the creak of branches and the rustle of leaves. As you press onward, a faint, eerie light flickers in the distance, drawing you off the path you thought you'd been following. At the heart of a hidden clearing stands a woman, and the forest itself seems to bend towards her. Morgan Le Fay, radiant and terrible, watches you with eyes that seem to pierce the fabric of time itself. Moonlight glows off her skin in a way that's not quite natural, casting her in a silver aura that shifts, flares, then fades like a breathing spell. Her dark hair moves as if touched by an unseen breeze, each strand alive with enchantment. She stands perfectly still, yet the air around her is charged, crackling with an energy that raises the hair on your forearms. You step forward. Roots twist and coil across the ground at her feet, responding to an unspoken will. The earth stirs, parting beneath her bare feet, revealing flickers of green fire that dance and pulse in time with her heartbeat. She lifts one hand, and suddenly, wisps of glowing mist swirl around you, forming into shapes, ancient symbols, letters of a language you can almost understand. They pulse with her power, illuminating the clearing in a spectral light, casting shifting shadows that dance across her face. Then, with a flick of her hand, the magic unwinds, leaving you breathless and drained, yet somehow fuller than before. The mist dissolves, releasing you, and as it does, she too begins to fade, melting into the shadows. The clearing darkens, her light extinguishing as though it had never been, leaving only the echo of her magic lingering in the air. You stumble back onto the path, your mind tingling with fragments of her spells, your skin alive with the ghosts of her enchantments. The forest is quiet, as if holding its breath, and you know you will never see her again. Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we do deep dives every week into a different woman of mythology and folklore from all over the world, from all across time, and we learn all about their origins, all about how they've changed over time, and where you can still find them today, and their legacies continuing on in modern pop culture. I'm India, and I'm your host, and I have been your host since the podcast started. I think this might be episode 13. Unlucky for some, but quite lucky for me because I didn't think I'd get this far with this podcast, and I'm loving it. I'm really, really enjoying it. Today we are peeling back the veil on one of the most mysterious figures from Arthurian legend, Morgan Le Fay. Was she a villain, a healer, a queen, or just a bit misunderstood? Today we'll dig into her origins, her legendary tales, her fascinating evolution over time, and her impact on modern pop culture. And I'm really, really excited to bring you this one. Arthurian legend has always fascinated me ever since I was a child, ever since my dad let me watch Monty Python and the Holy Grail, probably far too young. I've loved Arthurian legend, so I'm really, really chuffed to be bringing this one to you. I never thought I'd use the word chuffed on my podcast, but there we go. As always, if you enjoy the episode, please don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I have noticed that we've had quite a few new people joining us in the last week or so, and I am so grateful for that. It's just amazing to think that you're sitting at home or in your car or whatever you might be doing while you listen to this podcast and you're listening to me tell you about some really cool women. And I love it. I love it. So without any further ado, grab yourself a little snack, pour yourself something good to drink, and let's begin. Let's start where all legends begin, the origins. And who exactly is Morgan Le Fay? Well, her character is one of the oldest and often most ambiguous in Arthurian lore. And if we go back far enough, we find her beginnings in Celtic mythology. Morgan's origins trace back to the ancient Celts. Her name, sometimes written as Morgane or Morgana, likely derives from Welsh and the Breton word mor, meaning sea, and gan, meaning born of. And this actually connects her to an ancient archetype we've spoken about before on the podcast, known as the Morrigan, the goddess of war, death, and sovereignty in Irish mythology. The Morrigan, a bit like Morgan Le Fay, was also a shapeshifter and an omen bringer, often appearing as a crow or a raven on the battlefield. And this early connection with goddesses tied to war and the other world suggests that Morgan Le Fay might have been intended as a powerful supernatural figure right from the start. From these early Celtic influences, Morgan evolved into a figure in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Mellini in the 12th century, where she's depicted as a healer, residing on the Isle of Apples, also known as Avalon. Here, she's not the villainous sorceress that most know today, but rather a powerful enchantress who helps heal Arthur after the Battle of Camlan. And there are many maiden temptress and fairy mistress characters spread throughout the Arthurian romance genre, which might also be considered different aspects of Morgan, even though they're not explicitly named as such. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to the 13th century and explore Morgan Le Fay's story as it's told in some of the most influential medieval texts, including Le Morte d'Arthur. In these tales, Morgan is the youngest daughter of Igraine and her first husband, Gorloy, which makes her the half-sister of King Arthur, whose father was Uther Pendragon. Morgan's full sisters include the Queen of Orkney, who's actually the mother of Mordred, who is Arthur's future nemesis. As for Morgan, her own story is no less intense. She's married off unhappily to Urien and becomes the mother of Yvain, a future knight of the Round Table. But there's so much more to Morgan than her family ties. She studies magic under Merlin, grows into a powerful sorceress, and soon becomes a capricious and even vengeful figure amongst Arthur's knights. Her rivalry with Arthur's wife Guinevere is fierce, and she's often depicted as scheming and taking numerous lovers, rumoured to include Merlin himself, and possibly even Lancelot, who only fuels her bitterness with his unrequited love. I don't know about you, but because I've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, I can only picture Lancelot as John Cleese. He's not as heroic in my mind, he's just John Cleese. In some versions of the legend, especially Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, Morgan evolves into Arthur's greatest foe, attempting to seize the throne and become this kind of shadowy force in his downfall. But here's the twist. As the story progresses, Morgan ultimately reconciles with Arthur, returning to her earlier role as his guardian. In later legends, she becomes immortal, the immortal Queen of Avalon, often actually standing beside Arthur. So she really is very multifaceted. So what did she actually look like? Well, descriptions of Morgan Le Fay's appearance have evolved over the centuries, influenced by medieval texts, Renaissance art, and more modern adaptations. But a few key traits have remained consistent. Traditionally, she's portrayed as strikingly beautiful, with features that reflect her mysterious and powerful nature. In the earliest medieval texts, Morgan's physical appearance isn't actually often very detailed. Writers of this time tended to focus more on her magical abilities and her relationship to Arthur rather than her looks. However, when descriptions do appear, she's portrayed as alluring and enchantingly beautiful, a common trait for many sorcerers and enchantresses in folklore. Her beauty serves as a weapon and a distraction, allowing her to manipulate or influence others, especially male figures, to achieve her goals. Her appearance often echoes the medieval ideals of beauty: dark hair, fair skin, and sharp, penetrating eyes. Many texts actually do suggest that Morgan has penetrating or intense eyes which can mesmerise and intimidate, highlighting her power and intelligence. And when you think about it, if you've listened to my episode on the Morrigan, I know we've already spoken about the Morrigan in this episode too, she's quite similar in appearance, isn't she? This dark-haired, pale-skinned, beautiful, magical woman. And isn't it interesting that again already we're seeing sexuality and allure as something negative and something to be feared? In Renaissance art, Morgan Le Fay began to be depicted more like a classical goddess or sorceress, with flowing robes and regal attire that exudes power and nobility. Artists often showed her with luxurious fabrics and elaborate jewellery, a style that emphasised her status as both a noblewoman and an enchantress. And contemporary portrayals of Morgan vary quite dramatically, as writers and filmmakers reimagine her through different lenses and use different parts of her personality to influence how she looks. So some go for a more gothic or witchy aesthetic, some go for a more aging gracefully witch, and some for a more timeless and classic look to emphasise her beauty and allure, but also give her a look of wisdom and experience. Sometimes she's shown with a more athletic or commanding physique, aligning her role as both sorceress and strategist. And it's also worth mentioning that a recurring theme in Arthurian legend is Morgan's shape-shifting ability, which allowed her to appear young, old, beautiful, or terrifying, depending on her intentions. Her appearance was as changeable as her motives, reflecting her adaptability and the mysterious nature that surrounded her. In this sense, she could look like anyone or anything. She could use beauty to charm or seduce. She could use terror to frighten someone into doing what she wanted. She kind of had the freedom to do anything. And now I think about it, previously, if you'd have asked me, India, what superpower would you like? I probably would have said teleportation. But now I kind of think maybe shape-shifting is the way to go. Because it sounds like you could pretty much get whatever you wanted, couldn't you? And actually, now we say that, Morgan's not the first shapeshifter we've had on the podcast. We've had quite a few actually, haven't we? That's another thing. We've got duality and we've got shapeshifting. Common themes amongst female mythological characters. I digress. In short, Morgan Le Fay's appearance is one of alluring beauty, mystery and power, adapted to fit the cultural lens of each era, whether she's portrayed as a noblewoman or a gothic sorceress or an ageless queen. Her looks are inseparable from her magical prowess and her complex character. And I think you find that across the board with both male and female mythological figures. Their looks are so integral to their character, and they're often indicative of what kind of being they are. Are they benevolent? Are they wise? Are they cruel? And you can often find clues to that in the way somebody looks or the way somebody dresses. So now you know what she looks like, and we've sort of briefly touched on her origins and some of the stories that Morgan is in. Let's do a bit of a deeper dive into the most famous myths that define Morgan Le Fay's character. The tales of Morgan Le Fay have both shaped and been shaped by her mysterious persona, and they highlight her journey from a healer to a more ambiguous figure. One of Morgan's most well-known roles is in Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, where she's portrayed as King Arthur's half-sister. Here, her magic takes a bit of a darker turn. The tensions with her brother come to a head when Morgan driven by jealousy and a desire for power, steals Excalibur and replaces it with a fake. The old switcheroo, a tale as old as time. We're going back to Arthurian Legend and they're doing the switcheroony. She later tries to trap Arthur in a series of deadly schemes, most notably attempting to seduce his knights like Sir Lancelot, or creating enchantments to bring Arthur harm. Thwarting the scheme, Arthur recovers the sword, but she steals its magical scabbard, which has healing properties. She indirectly contributes to Arthur's fatal wounding in his final battle by stealing this. Mallory and other medieval writers were influenced by religious and cultural attitudes towards women and power, and that added layers of hostility to her character. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the podcast. In this tale, Morgan is born into a family of power and ambition. As a child, her life is marked by tragedy and magic. When Uther, in his obsession with Igraine, uses deception, magic, and Merlin's help to kill her father and seduce her mother, Morgan grows up harbouring a deep resentment towards Uther, Merlin, and eventually Arthur himself. Morgan is sent to a convent as a young girl, but instead of religious devotion, she becomes deeply interested in the forbidden art of sorcery. There, she learns powerful spells and discovers her gifts as an enchantress, setting the stage for her future role as one of the most skilled and dangerous sorcerers in Camelot. As Arthur rises to power and becomes the king, destined to bring peace to all of England, Morgan becomes more of a shadowy figure on the edge of his reign, both family and foe. Though Morgan is Arthur's half-sister, her loyalty to him is questionable to say the least, from the very start. Their relationship is complicated by old resentments, especially Morgan's hatred of Uther Pendragon, Arthur's father. He destroyed her family, and she feels slighted. Her powers overlooked, her ambitions were stifled in this male-dominated world. But rather than accept her place in Camelot, she becomes one of the court's most dangerous adversaries, using both magic and wit to manipulate, deceive, and occasionally help Arthur in ways that align with her own interests. Girlfriend was using what she had to get what she wanted, and I support it. I'm here for it. One of her earliest acts of betrayal comes when she attempts to steal Excalibur, Arthur's fabled sword. Morgan creates a replica, intending to keep the real Excalibur for herself, and she gives the counterfeit to her lover, Sir Accolon, hoping that he can use it to kill Arthur in battle. So she's doing the double here, she's doing the double, but Arthur actually just sees through this scheme and this attempt fails. And this episode marks Morgan as an actual true threat, willing to betray her own family for power. In Morgan's mind, Excalibur is more than just a sword. It's a symbol of power, and a weapon that she believes she deserves just as much as Arthur does. Her ambition runs deep, and she's willing to risk everything to take what she believes is rightfully hers. Morgan's schemes don't just stop with Arthur. Her complex relationship with the Knights of the Round Table, particularly Lancelot and Merlin, add another layer to her mysterious role in Camelot. Morgan's feelings towards Camelot's knights are also mixed. While she respects some of them, others are nothing more than pawns in her schemes. Sir Lancelot, Arthur's most trusted knight, and his queen's secret lover, is an object of Morgan's fascination. At times she seems to have unrequited feelings for him, but Lancelot never reciprocates. And in some tales, Morgan even attempts to seduce him, only to be rejected, fueling her resentment towards Camelot's favourite knight. Morgan is also tied to Merlin, who is both her mentor and rival in the magical arts. While she learns a great deal from him, she resents his control over her, and eventually surpasses him in skill. Their rivalry mirrors her own struggle for autonomy and power in a world dominated by men. Through these interactions with Merlin and the other knights, Morgan becomes even more complex. She's not simply a villain, but she's a woman asserting her power in a kingdom that limits her. Now, let's turn to one of the most intense rivalries in Le Morte d'Arthur, Morgan Le Fay and Queen Guinevere. Their mutual resentment sparks some of Morgan's most vengeful acts. It's girl-on-girl crime here. Because Morgan absolutely hates Guinevere, and it's a hatred that runs deep. And part of this enmity stems from her jealousy of Guinevere's influence over Arthur. That's a power that Morgan wants for herself. But the rivalry is also personal. Morgan sees Guinevere's infidelity with Lancelot as a betrayal to Arthur and an opportunity to weaken Camelot from within. And one of her most famous schemes involves exposing Guinevere's affair with Lancelot. She wants to spill the tea to everyone. And she does this by sending a magical cloak to Camelot as a gift for Guinevere, enchanted to burst into flames if worn by an unfaithful woman. Guinevere's actually quite smart though, and this cloak arrives and she's like, it feels a bit weird. I don't know if I trust this cloak. I don't think I'm going to wear it. Not my thing, not my style. So she actually manages to avoid that. But the cloak does add fuel to the ongoing tension between them, and it leaves the court buzzing with all of these rumours and distrust. It's a gift, why wouldn't she wear it? It's a lovely cloak. I'd want that, I'd wear it. Why isn't she wearing it? Through these manipulations, Morgan tries to shake the very foundations of Camelot, believing that exposing the Queen's affair will bring shame and ruin to Arthur's rule. And while she doesn't directly succeed, her schemes do contribute to an atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal that ultimately tears Camelot apart. And Morgan's schemes against Arthur reach their peak as the kingdom nears collapse, and she becomes a major player in his eventual downfall. In the final chapters of Le Morte d'Arthur, as Arthur's kingdom is crumbling, Morgan stands by, observing the destruction that she helped to set in motion. She supports Mordred, Arthur's illegitimate son, who ultimately rebels against his father, leading the deadly battle of Camlan. Though she isn't directly responsible for Arthur's death, her influence has weakened his reign and hastened his fall. And here's where it takes a bit of an odd turn, because even after all the betrayal and all the schemes, after the battle, Arthur is mortally wounded, and it is Morgan, his bitter enemy, but also his sister, who arrives to take him to Avalon. She appears as part of a mystical procession of queens, promising to heal him in an otherworldly realm. This final act gives her character a little splash of redemption and reconciliation, hinting that despite all the conflict, she does still care for Arthur in her own special way. When Arthur is brought to the lake, it's Morgan who is there, alongside the queens of Avalon, to take him to his final rest. This moment reveals the real complexity of Morgan's love and loyalty. She was his enemy, yes, but she was also his sister. So what does Morgan Le Fay's role teach us? How has this character, shaped by betrayal, ambition and magic, become one of the most enduring figures in legend? Well, it's because she's more than just a villain. She represents the tension between loyalty and ambition, between familial love and personal power. Her actions bring about some of Camelot's greatest tragedies, but they also highlight the kingdom's underlying flaws, including its failure to recognise and respect female power. By the end of the tale, Morgan emerges as a symbol of magic's dual nature. It can heal and destroy, enchant and deceive, depending on the wielder's will. Morgan's role in Arthurian legend is a reminder that myths are rarely ever simple. Her character is so complex, it's filled with contradictions, and shaped by a relentless quest for respect and autonomy. She's in many ways the shadow of Camelot, embodying everything it refuses to accept, but cannot escape. And it's interesting because, as I said earlier, in older tellings of the Arthurian story, Morgan's a far more benevolent figure right from the start. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Vita Melini, composed in the 12th century, describes Morgan as the most beautiful of 9 sisters who rule Avalon, the Fortunate Isle. She also has healing powers and can shapeshift and fly, and after Arthur is wounded in Camlan, he's brought to her for healing. Far from plotting his downfall, she promises that she can heal him, make him better. So it's interesting, why did she change from this benevolent and caring sister in the 12th century to one who despises him and betrays him in the 13th? And did interpretations of her change even further after that? Shall we find out? From healer to femme fatale to modern-day feminist icon, Morgan Le Fay's character has evolved to mirror changing societal views on women, magic, and power. We know that in early renditions, Morgan's character wasn't inherently evil, but as Christianity spread throughout Europe, views on sorcery and strong women shifted, and Morgan transformed from a healer and an enchantress to a more witch-like figure, embodying temptations and defying the virtuous ideals associated with Arthur's kingdom. And this evolution reflects medieval anxieties about women, and especially women who wielded influence outside of traditional roles, and female magic was often branded as dangerous at this time. And it also reflects the ways that female sexuality was seen as something to be feared, like we said earlier. And this is common across many of the women we've spoken about in this podcast so far. Sexuality is a weapon, it's something to be feared. Femininity, something to be feared. Attraction, something to be feared. Christianity had a profound impact on interpretations of Morgan Le Fay, transforming her from that neutral, benevolent enchantress in early Celtic lore to a morally ambiguous or even villainous figure in later medieval Christian retellings. As the Arthurian legend evolved with the context of a Christianized Europe, Morgan's character was reshaped to reflect the church's views on magic, female autonomy, and power. As Christian writers took up the legend, Morgan's role as a healer was increasingly overshadowed by her magical powers, and Christianity held very negative views of magic, associating it with heresy, demonic influence, and rebellion against God's will. And this caused Morgan's sorcery to be cast in a much darker light. Her magic became to be a sign of defiance, a departure from Christian virtues of humility and obedience. Medieval Christian society was often quite suspicious of powerful and autonomous women, especially those who operated outside the boundaries of marriage and motherhood. Morgan was an independent woman, skilled in forbidden arts, and she came to embody the era's fear of female power. Her knowledge of magic and her defiance of authority posed a challenge to the ideals of submissive, devout womanhood, which was upheld by the church and encouraged by the church. And consequently, her character was gradually painted as more dangerous, more manipulative, and morally corrupt. Texts like Le Morte d'Arthur transformed her into a seductress and a deceiver, whose actions were driven by jealousy, vengeance, and sexual intrigue. For instance, her antagonism towards Guinevere and her multiple lovers, relationships that would have been normal for Celtic goddesses, were depicted as sins or signs of moral depravity in the Christianized versions of the legend. And under Christianity's influence, these relationships with male figures became more central to her characterization. She's almost depicted as this predatory figure who attempts to seduce Lancelot and schemes against Guinevere. Her sexuality and power are seen as threats to the chaste and orderly world that Arthur and his knights had strived to achieve. And this theme of femme fatale was quite common in Christianized medieval literature, where female characters who defied social norms were often portrayed as temptresses who led men astray. And Morgan's role became just that, a seductress whose allure posed as a spiritual and moral danger to the Knights of the Round Table. Interestingly though, Christian's influence on Morgan's character isn't solely negative. Do you remember the complete 180 that she did at the end of the tale that I just told you? In doing so, Morgan shows a more complex redemptive side in the story's closing moments. After all her years of plotting and opposition, she ultimately comes back to take Arthur to Avalon. And this act of caring for Arthur in his final moments suggests that her role is not simply that of a villain, and some scholars argue that this is actually a redemptive ending where she acts as a compassionate figure in death, reflecting the Christian narrative of forgiveness and repentance. It allows Morgan to embody both the feared sorcerer's role and the sorrowful sister, this duality that makes her character resonate with themes of redemption and family loyalty despite her earlier transgressions. Christianity's influence on Morgan Le Fay turned her from an enigmatic healer into a symbol of the forbidden and the dangerous, a complex, morally ambiguous character whose magic and independence conflicted with the era's ideals. As a result, she became one of the most intriguing figures in Arthurian legend, embodying both the allure and threat of female autonomy. Her character's shift from healer to adversary reflects not just a shift in her story, but a shift in society's view of power, magic, and womanhood in the medieval Christian period. And Morgan's enduring appeal actually lies in this very duality. She's both tragic and powerful. She embodies the tensions between ancient pagan ideals and Christian morality, and reminds us that the villains in myths are often mirrors of the fears and values of their time. Now, let's explore how Morgan's character has transcended myth to influence modern pop culture. From TV series to comic books, she's everywhere, and her presence is as powerful as ever. By the 20th century, as feminist thought gained more momentum, many writers and artists began to reinterpret Morgan. In The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley, she becomes a sympathetic character, a woman trapped in a patriarchal society, struggling to maintain the old pagan ways against a tide of Christian ideology. Here, Morgan, or Morgaine, is a priestess fighting to protect Avalon's wisdom. And this novel actually sparked a resurgence in Morgan's popularity and repositioned her as a misunderstood hero rather than a villain. In The Mists of Avalon, Morgan is no longer a mere sorceress, but a guardian of ancient magic and a woman bound by duty. And the novel asks us to question, is Morgan a villain, or is she simply fighting for her beliefs in a world determined to demonize her? And this is usually where I'd say, add that book to your TBR, but due to the absolute disgusting grossness of the author that wrote that book, I am not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to talk about another book series that I have actually read and really enjoyed. So if you're wanting to delve a little bit deeper into Arthurian legend and like sort of modern takes on mythology with a bit of YA sprinkling, then I'd really recommend the Legendborn cycle. There's currently 2 books, there's Legendborn and Bloodmarked, and there's a third on the way. So direct your attention there, and not to The Mists of Avalon. It is actually a really fun book that not only explores Arthurian legend, but also themes of racism and LGBT, and it's written by a woman of colour. So let's opt for supporting that over The Mists of Avalon. Anyway, that's me off of my soapbox. You can Google that if you want to, but trigger warning, the author did some horrific things, so I'd just ignore it and pick up Legendborn because it's really, really good. So anyway, let's talk more about Morgan Le Fay in modern day pop culture. Over the last few decades, writers have given us incredible, complex reimaginings of Morgan, and there are so many I could never sit here and name them all because you would get very bored, but I will list a few that stand out. Obviously, I've just mentioned Legendborn, so do pick that one up, but there's also a series that roots Morgan's story in the historical setting of 6th century Scotland, and it's called The Lost Queen by Signe Pike. Here, Morgan isn't a magical villain, but a woman of wisdom and spirituality. In this series, she appears as Langareth, a historical figure influenced by Celtic traditions and ancient beliefs. And the story takes place in a world torn between Christianity and older pagan customs, setting up this clash of cultures. And there's also The Guinevere Deception, which is a YA fantasy by Kirsten White, and this is Camelot reimagined for the younger generation. Morgan is known as Morgana in this book, And she plays quite a mysterious and morally ambiguous role. Her presence looms as both a challenge and a mentor figure for Guinevere, who arrives in Camelot with her own secrets. And this one sort of explores more boundaries of friendship and loyalty and power dynamics, showing Morgan as someone who might be just as misunderstood as she is feared. And finally, there is Morgan Is My Name, which explores how Morgan's early experiences and relationships shape her into the powerful woman she becomes. And this portrayal is quite deeply human and highlights Morgan's internal struggles, making her quite a relatable young woman who grows into her power and her complexity. So, from historical epics to modern fantasies, today's writers are constantly reshaping Morgan Le Fay into this richly complex figure. And these stories remind us that Morgan isn't just a villain, she's a woman with her own ambitions and friendships and struggles. In each of these books, Morgan Le Fay is brought to life in new ways, challenging our ideas of who she is and what she stands for. And Morgan isn't just confined to the page. You may very well have seen her on screen in the BBC series Merlin. Here she is rebranded again as Morgana and begins as a compassionate figure who slowly turns against Arthur due to betrayals and manipulations, painting a nuanced portrait of how tragedy and isolation can turn a hero into an anti-hero. This adaptation offers a sympathetic take on her fall, suggesting that her turn to dark magic is fueled by her mistreatment. This is another one of those Tumblr shows, isn't it? I'm pretty sure I remember seeing many Merlin edits in my after-school Tumblr doom scrolling times. That was like before doom scrolling was like a term. I would go home onto my Daniel Radcliffe Tumblr and look at gifs of Supernatural and Sherlock and Merlin. That is such a badge of my generation. But weirdly, I've seen all these gifs, but I've never actually seen it. And my grandma actually really loves that show, so I feel like I should check it out for that reason. And Morgan Le Fay has actually made so many memorable appearances in various TV shows and films, where she's portrayed with a range of personalities, from fierce villain to misunderstood anti-hero. Over the years, her character has been adapted in many ways, showcasing her magic, her complicated relationship with Arthur, and her constant tension with Camelot. And speaking of Camelot, in the show of the same name, Morgan Le Fay is played by Eva Green, whose intense dark portrayal brings out that ruthlessness and ambition. In this version, Morgan is driven by her desire for power and her resentment towards Arthur, who holds the throne that she believes belongs to her. And this is a bit more of a sexy, dark, seductive Morgan, definitely more of the femme fatale. And she's also been played by Helen Mirren in the movie Excalibur, in one of the most iconic film portrayals of the character. In this adaptation, Morgan is depicted as a master of dark magic and deception. She learns sorcery from Merlin and eventually uses the powers to seduce her half-brother Arthur, leading to the birth of Mordred, who ultimately brings about Arthur's downfall. Now, I haven't actually seen this, but I have read, and I quote, "Mirren's performance as Morgan is intense and chilling, perfectly capturing the dark, seductive side of Morgan Le Fay." And I would be a terrible certified Disney adult if I did not mention this one. Do you remember Madame Mim from The Sword and the Stone? Well, while Morgan Le Fay isn't directly featured in that movie, the character of Madame Mim is very much inspired by Morgan Le Fay's archetype. Mim is a comically evil, bumbling sorceress who uses her magic to battle Merlin, embodying the mischievous and chaotic energy often associated with Morgan in more traditional lore. While Mim is a bit more light-hearted, she represents this playful villainous take on Morgan's character. And yes, The Sword and the Stone does take a lot of liberties with the Arthurian legend, but Mim's character has become a beloved villain in her own right. Her portrayal reflects Morgan Le Fay's influence on popular culture, showing that the character and her traits can be adapted into more family-friendly storytelling. And honestly, guys, I really haven't even scratched the surface with literature, film and TV here. There are so many. She's in Marvel, she's in video games, she's everywhere. She is fantastic. And I really would encourage you guys to go and do a bit of your own research on Morgan Le Fay, because this episode is already very long and it quite easily could be longer. I've really enjoyed researching Morgan Le Fay, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to everything I've had to say about her, which is a lot apparently. Today, Morgan Le Fay continues to inspire feminist readers and writers as a figure of both resilience and defiance. She embodies both the power and the cost of being a woman who seeks to control her own destiny in a world that attempts to restrict her. She has become a symbol for women who face similar challenges, particularly those who defy convention or fight for their own rights. In popular culture, Morgan's character has been used to explore themes of female empowerment, self-acceptance, and rebellion. She serves as a reminder that powerful women are often feared and vilified, but reclaiming one's story, as Morgan has been in feminist reinterpretations, can transform them from a villain to an icon. Morgan Le Fay's journey from misunderstood sorceress to feminist symbol reflects how society's views on women, power and autonomy have evolved. She is both a hero and a cautionary tale, a figure who embodies the struggles and triumphs of women who defy norms. Her character continues to resonate with those who see themselves in her quest for self-determination, making Morgan Le Fay not just a figure of legend, but an icon of feminist resilience and complexity. So when you think of Morgan Le Fay, remember she's more than just a sorceress or an antagonist. She's a figure who defied a world that tried to contain her, and in doing so, she became a powerful voice for the feminist movement, showing us that even the most ancient stories have the power to inspire and change. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of Morgan Le Fay. Whether you see her as a villain, a hero, or something in between, one thing is certain: Morgan's magic has endured the test of time, evolving with us and continuing to enchant. As always, I have picked my favourite parts that I read and researched as part of this episode. There are very many different versions of the stories of Morgan Le Fay, and as always, I will encourage you to go out there and find out some of those things for yourself. Do some of the reading for yourself, and I'll leave the links in the show notes to all of the stuff that I used to research this episode, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to subscribe. Please do leave me a little rating, leave me a comment, tell me what you want to hear about next. I have got some great things planned for you coming up. But for now, thank you once again for listening, and I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.